Oh boy, welcome to Unit 4. This unit covers the time period 1800 to 1848 in American history. I would give an overview of what that entails, but I believe that's the video's job to do. This unit is worth quite a bit on your AP exam though, so no skipping it. As for this video is simply a clipped together video of all my Unit 4 topic review videos without the AP style questions at the end of each video. If you want to try your hand at some AP style questions associated with each topic of Unit 4, the Unit 4 playlist is in the description. To support more content like this, please consider checking out my socials, but anyway, let's get into Unit 4. Topic 4.2 is about the age of Jefferson's term in office and really what just happened. So, Thomas Jefferson, a die-hard Democratic Republican, takes office after the Federalist rule of Adams. Continuing into this period, we have these two parties debating over relations with the French and the British and powers of the federal government. All things covered in my Topic 3.10 video. But we start seeing debates over something new around this period known as tariffs, which is a tax on imported goods, meaning goods coming into America. This tax is paid by American companies, which typically raise their prices to accommodate for the tax. Understand that in a world where the South is typically known as a rural agrarian expanse known for farming, and the North is known for their industries and manufacturers, the South would be negatively affected by these tariffs as they need to import lots of goods because of the lack of industries they have. The North would benefit from this tax as Americans would start only buying American manufactured goods. The Democratic Republicans hated the idea of tariffs, aligning themselves with the South. The Federalists liked the ideas of tariffs, aligning themselves with the Northern view. During Jefferson's presidency, he enacted the trade embargo of 1807, which made it so America would stop importing Britain's goods. This would end up backfiring and hurting the American economy. But possibly the most famous part of Jefferson's presidency was the case Marbury v. Madison, which was a Supreme Court case that established the concept of judicial review, which allowed the Supreme Court to review and invalidate actions taken by the other branches of government if they are deemed unconstitutional. And another popular thing is even more westward expansion. The US wanted the land of New Orleans and negotiated with France to get it. France offered the entire Louisiana territory as they were facing financial issues because of Napoleon, and the US bought it for $15 million. Now with all this territory, the US wanted to map it, so they sent Lewis and Clark on an expedition with the Native American guide of Sacagawea to help them. They went all the way from St. Louis to the Pacific and mapped out the western territories and realized, truly, how big it was. Topic 4.3 starts talking about tensions in the US economy and differing viewpoints. Some war broke out between Britain and the US in 1812 caused by British supporting Native American tribes and impressment on American sailors. It ended in a draw with the Treaty of Ghent that the US saw as a win, mostly because of the nationalism caused by the Battle of New Orleans. During this war, Federalists met at the Hartford Convention discussing disapproval of the war and potential secession. After America quote-unquote won this war, this convention would lead to the party's demise. And that leads into the introduction of a man who lots of people don't like, including me, Henry Clay. This guy was a lawyer, Secretary of State, leader of a future political party, and so influential in this period. He introduced something known as the American system. This was a response to the War of 1812 and suggested to provide national economic growth by establishing a protective tariff, creating a national bank, and funding internal improvements like roads and canals. This was so controversial and caused many debates to arise from the Democratic Republicans, later known as the Democrats, who opposed it, and the New National Republicans, later known as the Whigs, who supported it. The Supreme Court had its say with its McCulloch v. Maryland case, which established that federal power trumps state power. But who cares about that? It's time to talk about early Civil War causes. So throughout the early republic, states kept getting added and became either a slave or free state. As this continued, in 1819 there was a balance of 11 slave states and 11 free states. But as America was expanding westward, Missouri was added as a state. The South wanted it to be a slave state, and it ended up becoming one. The North, however, felt cheated and made the Missouri Compromise, which added Maine as an official free state and said above a certain line there couldn't be any more slave states. This shows the start of weak compromises, creating tension upon tension until eventual war. And how about even more Civil War causes? The Protective Tariff of 1828 put a tax on imported goods, and the South was very mad at it, even to the point they called it the Tariff of Abominations. This led to the South Carolina Exposition and the nullification crisis, where the South openly protested the tariff. There likely would have been war if it wasn't for Calhoun and Clay, who proposed the Tariff of 1833, which would lower the tax over the years. But what this shows is the South can and will revolt if it doesn't like something, foreshadowing the eventual Civil War. Topic 4.4 is about America's relations with other countries throughout the beginning of the 19th century. So it's fair to say America was struggling in this time to create a global presence. Turns out, inciting a revolution to create a nation doesn't get respect from other nations that have been on the globe for much longer. The US tried to rectify this through things like the War of 1812, but they needed more land. What they did first was acquire Florida from Spain in 1819 under these two treaties, and they also started a war where they forced the Seminole tribes out of the Florida lands. The US also decided to prove their naval might, which they did by inciting the Barbary Wars against North African states. But the big thing to talk about is, as America kept spreading westward, there was more and more conflict with Native Americans. Britain saw this as an opportunity to support the Native Americans against the Americans. This would cause President James Monroe to pass the Monroe Doctrine, which declared to Britain that any involvement in America by European powers would be seen as an act of war. And to add insult to injury, America also passed Macon's Bill No. 2, which prohibited French and British warships from entering American harbors. Topic 4.5 introduces the Market Revolution. The time of which great innovation in mechanization, agriculture, and commerce occurred is largely called and known as the Market Revolution, which is just a little part of the larger industrial evolution of the world. Inventions like the textile machinery, steam engines, interchangeable parts, the telegraph, and agricultural inventions made production methods of different products so much faster and easier, causing entrepreneurs to make a lot of goods and businesses, causing people to buy more goods, and you get the idea. One thing to note about the Market Revolution is the difference in evolution between the North and the South. The North became a place for all industries, housing all types of manufacturing and businesses. The advent of the cotton gin caused the South to farm cotton furiously, making the South grow up making mostly farms, having slaves work at them, and selling the cotton from those farms for massive amounts of money. Now, of course, the South needed to sell these goods to other countries mostly, but different legislation and judicial systems support of development of roads and canals and railroads caused American regional markets and selling to grow. This would link the North and the South heavily, but it should still be noted that no matter how much the North and South are connected in this time period before the Civil War, these areas were different on values and culture and could not coexist peacefully with one another. The Market Revolution would also have a massive impact on society and culture as well, but that is a next video problem. Topic 4.6 introduces the societal and cultural impacts of the Market Revolution. The innovations in technology, agriculture, and commerce we talked about last time didn't just make goods and businesses. They changed how people lived, worked, and thought about themselves. Large numbers of international migrants flooded into industrializing northern cities to find factory work. An example of a city growing heavily industrialized from this being Philadelphia. At the same time, a lot of Americans moved west of the Appalachians, building new communities along the Ohio and Mississippi rivers, with some cities growing here like St. Louis and Cincinnati. This movement created a new dynamic between regions as the North urbanized while the West focused on agriculture. Next, let's talk about wealth and class. Manufacturing growth led to higher standards of living for some folks, creating a bigger middle class and a wealthy business elite. But it should be noted, it also created a large and growing population of laboring poor who worked for long hours for low wages in these factories. Life was better for some, but definitely not for all. As for gender and family roles, with the rise of factories, many Americans, both men and women, stopped relying on farming to survive. Instead, they worked to produce goods for distant markets. This shift brought about new ideas of gender roles. Women especially were expected to stay home and embrace domestic ideals, which emphasized the separation of public work life for men and private home life for women. Not everybody was happy about this. Topic 4.7 talks about expanding democracy from 1800 to 1848. Democracy in America went from being exclusive to rich, landowning white men to slightly less exclusive. By the 1840s, almost all adult white men could vote. So is that progress? Kind of. The big shift came with the elimination of property requirements for voting. Before this, you had to own land to cast a ballot, but as more states dropped this rule, voting rights expanded, and participatory democracy became a thing. One key event you should know is the Dorr Rebellion in Rhode Island, where Thomas Dorr and his supporters pushed for a new state constitution to expand voting rights, since the original charter only let landowners vote. Basically, more people got involved in politics. However, it's important to note this only applied to white men. Women, Black Americans, and indigenous people were still left out. Now, with more people voting, political parties formed. The actual details of these political parties will be covered next video. But for now, all you should know is that the whole political framework of the 1820s up to the Civil War was known as the second party system. Oh boy, Andrew Jackson. We already get to talk about such an amazing man. And before I get canceled on Twitter, I'd like to say that I'm using a rare attribute called sarcasm. So new political parties emerged in the 1820s and 1830s. On one side, you had the Democrats led by Andrew Jackson, who believed in a limited federal government. Jackson was all about the common man, opposing elites and big government institutions. He famously hated the National Bank, calling it a corrupt tool of the wealthy. He vetoed its recharter in 1832 and moved federal funds to state banks, known as pet banks. On the other side, you had the Whigs, led by Henry Clay, who supported a stronger federal government. Remember that American system we talked about before? Well, the Whigs loved it. The thing is, the American system embodied every single thing Andrew Jackson despised. The debates in the American system weren't just political, they shaped the economy, infrastructure, and the direction of the country. As expansion roared heavily on the frontier, Jackson backed the frontier settlers with policies like the Indian Removal Act of 1830, which forced Native American tribes off of their land. This led to the Trail of Tears, where thousands of Cherokee were forcibly relocated to what is now Oklahoma, suffering greatly along the way. Jackson's policies made him a hero to many frontier settlers, but his use of federal power sparked fierce debates about whether the government was protecting citizens or abusing its power, especially when it came to native lands and the economy. Topic 4.9 talks about the development of a new American culture. Between 1800 and 1848, America wasn't just growing politically or economically, it was developing its own national identity. This new national culture combined American, European, and regional influences. In art, you had movements like the Hudson River School, which painted breathtaking landscapes of the American frontier. It wasn't just for art's sake, it symbolized manifest destiny and the idea that American natural beauty was something special. Meanwhile, writers like Washington Irving gave us stories like The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, blending European storytelling traditions with American settings and themes. But it wasn't all spooky stories and pretty paintings. Philosophy was evolving too. Case in point, Transcendentalism, a movement led by people like Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau. They believed in individualism, nature, and the idea that humans could achieve personal perfection. Sounds inspiring, right? But it also had a political edge. Transcendentalists were big on social reform, especially abolitionism and women's rights. On the darker side of American culture, Gothic literature was making its mark. The big person here is Edgar Allan Poe with stories like The Telltale Heart, which is literally a story describing in vivid detail killing an old man, dismembering the body in a bathtub, and stuffing the body parts under a floorboard. I mean, hats off to this man. Finally, architecture played a key role in shaping the national identity. Buildings in Washington, D.C. like the White House and the Capitol were designed with neoclassical architecture inspired by ancient Greece and Rome. This is because America wanted to position itself as a modern republic with deep roots in democratic ideals. So the Second Great Awakening, what is it? Short answer, it was a religious revival. But more than that, it was a massive cultural shift that reshaped American society and politics. So you might be wondering, what caused the Second Great Awakening? Well, a few things. First was the rise of democratic and individualistic beliefs. Second was a response to rationalism because of criticism of the Enlightenment being too rational-based. And let's not forget the market revolution, which uprooted communities and made people more mobile, creating new opportunities for religious movements to spread. Here's some examples of parts of this movement. Camp meetings became huge social events, especially on the frontier. Preachers like Charles G. Finley led emotional, fiery revivals in places like the burned-over district of New York, where religious enthusiasm ran so high it was said that there was no one left to convert. The Second Great Awakening also sparked major reform movements. Religious leaders preached that individuals could achieve personal salvation and improve society. This inspired people to tackle issues like abolitionism, temperance, and women's rights. Jarena Lee and Harry Hosier? We'll go with Hosier. Two prominent African-American preachers challenged traditional ideas by showing that Black Americans and women could lead in spiritual life. And one more thing, new religious movements emerged. Joseph Smith founded the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, or Mormons, while William Miller's predictions about the end of the world led to the formation of the Adventist churches. So between 1800 and 1848, America experienced a wave of reform movements that aimed to fix society's problems and expand rights and opportunities. First, let's talk about what sparked these movements. The Second Great Awakening played a huge role. It wasn't just a religious revival, it encouraged people to believe that individuals could improve themselves and society. This, combined with the market revolution and greater mobility, made people more interested in reforming moral and social issues. So let's look at some reform movements. First up, abolition. The abolitionist movement grew in the North, calling for the immediate end of slavery. Leaders like William Lloyd Garrison published The Liberator, demanding freedom for enslaved people. Meanwhile, free African Americans like Frederick Douglass became powerful voices in the movement, sharing first-hand accounts of slavery's horrors. Then there was women's rights. In 1848, reformers like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott organized the Seneca Falls Convention, where they called for the greater equality of women. They even issued the Declaration of Sentiments, which borrowed language from the Declaration of Independence to demand women's rights to vote. This caused this time period to be dubbed the era of first-wave feminism. The temperance movement aimed to reduce alcohol consumption. Reformers believed drinking led to poverty, crime, and broken families. And of course, you know that there's no way that's true. Organizers like the Daughters of Temperance pushed for laws to limit or ban alcohol. Finally, utopian communities popped up around the country. Groups like the Shakers and Brook Farm tried to create perfect societies by rejecting traditional norms and focusing on communal living. But if there's one thing this course should teach you, it is that life is suffering, and of course all of these communities fail. In this time period, African Americans, both enslaved and free, faced enormous challenges. But they also created communities and strategies to protect their dignity and fight for freedom. So what stayed the same and what changed? changed. In the South, enslaved people continued to resist their oppression, but their efforts to end slavery were largely limited to rebellions, and most were unsuccessful. One of the most famous was Nat Turner's rebellion in 1831. Turner, an enslaved preacher, led a violent uprising in Virginia that resulted in the deaths of over 50 people. The rebellion terrified Southern whites and led to harsher slave laws. Meanwhile, in the North, abolitionist movements were growing. The free African American population increased, especially in cities like Philadelphia and Boston. Many African Americans founded their own communities and institutions to preserve their culture and fight for their rights. For example, the African Meeting House in Boston, built in 1806, became a hub for education, abolitionist meetings, and religious services. One key thing African Americans did was use the press. In 1827, Freedom's Journal became the first Black-owned and operated newspaper in the United States. It gave African Americans a platform to speak out against slavery and challenge racist policies. But you have to understand, the biggest thing that helped these African Americans was their own spiritual commitment. Like, for example, enslaved people in New Orleans gathered at Congo Square on Sundays to play music, dance, and preserve their cultural traditions. These gatherings helped them maintain a sense of identity and community, even in the face of oppression. So here's the line to take away from this whole video. While African Americans faced harsh conditions and discrimination, they found ways to resist and fight for their freedom. America, a beautiful country of glorious cities, but there's really only one place you can call perfect. That's right, the American South. So what was the South like in this time period? Well, first off, geography and the environment shaped the South's economy and identity. Southern land was perfect for growing cash crops like cotton, tobacco, and sugar, but there was also a problem: overcultivation. The soil in the Southeast became depleted, so slaveholders moved west, expanding plantations into new fertile land in places like Alabama, Mississippi, and Texas. Alright, enough beating around the bush. So slavery. Although most Southerners didn't own enslaved people, the region's economy and leadership were built on slavery. Southern leaders like John C. Calhoun went from calling slavery a necessary evil to defending it as a positive good. According to Calhoun, slavery wasn't just acceptable, it was essential to the Southern way of life. This focus on agriculture and slavery gave the South a distinct regional identity. While the North industrialized and diversified, the South stayed locked in traditional agricultural staples and resisted change. Southern business leaders kept relying on cotton exports to drive their economy, which made the South heavily dependent on both slavery and foreign trade. So what to take away from this is the South became its kind of own place and culture during this time period, and this tension with the North would, wait, say it with me, cause a future war. Thank you so much for watching. Also, why don't you click on this end screen here? It's a non-educational video I spent a lot of time on. Come on, man. Please. Please.